an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Dandelion Dynasty Book 3, The Veiled Throne, Chapters 43 through 45, The Sea of Tears, The Third Contest, and Alone. In these chapters, we get the final installment of the Restaurant Wars, which very bizarrely culminates in a competition between a parade and a roller coaster. Okay, sure. I guess we're doing this. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. What's up, Kyle? So yeah, it just felt like a really strange direction for things to go in, you guys. I don't dislike it, and I'm not trying to say that, but you know, I'm definitely going to back up and talk about Sea of Tears, of course, but I just needed to address this because of the fact that we talked for a while last episode about the overall kind of controversy that it seems like including the Restaurant Wars so extensively wound up sparking amongst fans of these books. And I have been very much on board this entire time with the decision to go for such a prolonged look at the Restaurant Wars. I feel like this is officially where he sort of lost me. And that's not to say that like there weren't interesting points being made here or that I wasn't engaged on it. It just feels like if you're going to do a story about, or not a story, if you're going to have a leg of the competition that is about restaurant entertainment, a decision to have there be two completely separate types of entertainment from what the restaurants actually offer, or it doesn't make any sense to me. You know, like the last segment where they were approaching competition of customer service, we obviously had to introduce these like strange carts that, you know, it was a compensation for the fact that a bunch of this Splendid Urns staff bailed and they were being sabotaged, and they needed to come up with a way to still manufacture service for all of these customers out of nothing. And so the fact that they were using these inventions that I'm pretty confident the Splendid Urn is not likely to actually use during regular dinner service, but I may be wrong. That was fine. Now, though, we're getting into two completely separate issues. Entertainment at a restaurant and a huge over-the-top parade through the center of town, or an indoor roller coaster. Those don't feel like they have the slightest bit to do with the restaurants themselves. And even the decision to go ahead and tell a Ryukyu myth through this like roller coaster, it feels like a strange choice because that's not linked to the Splendid Urn in any way other than obviously Kinri's, but they don't know about that. So I genuinely don't understand what the criteria was for this leg of the competition, because I assumed that it was going to wind up being the same thing, like you are going to display to us the kinds of entertainment that you can come to expect at the restaurant. And not only that, but again, there's the rule about having people working for you that weren't working for you before the competition began. Where do you draw the line on that? Because like the creation of this roller coaster feels like this is the question with the carts as well, to be fair. But I just don't really know I don't really understand how this is part of the competition. This is the one place where I kind of was like stepping back going, all it feels like is Ken Liu wanted to talk about Mapidere and the way that new generations see him. And he wanted to introduce the concept of a roller coaster for probably other reasons later down the line. I'm going to guess maybe to train Garinifin riders. Because it seems like it's like a likely connection. But it does not feel like it belongs in this competition. And I was honestly like a little bit irritated about it. So there's nobody in the chat right now, which is too bad because I really do want to know what you guys all felt about this. Because like I said, it would be one thing if there were if this were done as a ride, but there were also a table and there were like meals that went along with the segments of the story. If there was any food involvement, I confess I had been listening to all the sections before this more than once. I only listened to this once and I maybe missed a mention of something, but I don't believe that I did. And I don't understand what the hell we're doing at this point. Like, even the entertainment, if there were a meal, like, how is this anything? I don't understand. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm not trying, like I said, while I was reading it, it wasn't like I wasn't engaged and wanting to know who was going to win. It was more that I got drawn into the concept of it. And then when I took a step back afterward and looked at what it was, I was sort of like, wait, what? And it sort of won me over despite myself. And then my better judgment finally took over. Kind of like I have this a lot with Ridley Scott movies, where he manages to make everything so slick and convincing in the moment. And then when you leave the theater and you think back over what you just watched, you realize that it was kind of a lot of nonsense. So, and that's really not common in these books. I just feel like Ken Liu was reaching quite a bit in this section because he had something he wanted to include and he organized this competition around what he wanted to include in a way that up to this point has worked pretty well. But here we really see that it feels very clumsy and forced and contrived. So let's back up and talk about the Sea of Tears. Because this is a pretty serious situation here. We have got Tanto, who is Thera's son, and he is talking to one of the scholars that has helped them escape from the Liuku. They are on these Garinifins, and they are trying to find some place that they can land and have some water and survive for a little while. And he asks him, did they really mean to let us go? And this is what we get here, because like I was sort of theorizing about some things last time, but in this section we get Razutana spelling everything out every step of the way, which I'm willing to accept is for Tanto's sake, because he doesn't understand and he needs to be told like very explicitly every step of why they did what they did. But it did kind of feel like Ken Liu not trusting his audience to understand, and like he was explaining to us. So yeah, I don't like, I don't know, your mileage may vary on that. And this is when Razutana says, your mom's a really great leader, but she isn't really as capable of being ruthless. Your grandfather knew when he needed to cut his losses sometimes, and she's not as good at that. And she wouldn't have wanted to leave any of us behind, which would mean that they all would have died. So Tuf and Radia did what they knew they had to do in order to get her away and hopefully save you all as well. But otherwise, nobody was going to survive. And we find out, because I was wondering about the whole thing with Vara, Tuf tried to say, we have a plan, and she wasn't comprehending what he was doing, and the whole thing was an accident. Why couldn't they have just told us their plan ahead of time? Because if you knew, you wouldn't have been able to convincingly show your hatred for them in front of the Yukupekyu. Taro was silent with shame. He thought of himself as a brave fighter like his father and a great leader like his mother. To be treated as a burden, a mere child who had to be left behind and deceived into doing the right thing, he didn't have the words for how he felt. Staying alive right now is the best thing you can do to help your parents. Tonto nodded, but he vowed to do more to change their fate as soon as he found a chance. He was a Pekyu Ta'asa of the Agon people, and he would not be denied the chance to prove his mettle. Oh boy, I don't like the sound of that at all. This is the sound of somebody whose pride has been injured, and instead of realizing that they have a lot to learn, they are taking it very personally and deciding that they're going to act out and do some stupid shit. And it really bums me out when somebody has this moment of discovering that they were way behind in understanding what was truly happening. And instead of letting that sink in and taking a moment to be like, wow, maybe I don't know everything, their instinct is, I'll show you all. Like, will you? Because it doesn't seem like you even know what that means. So I'm very concerned about what's going to happen here. So then we get the description of the Sea of Tears and the Ghost River. The Sea of Tears, the Blood River, and the Ghost River. So let's see, Blood River has really reddish water, and it has to be allowed to settle and then filtered before it can be drunk. And then the second river kind of comes and goes because it is a very shallow river, and it's the way that it flows can be really unpredictable, and sometimes it just dries up entirely, which would be a pretty good reason to call it the Ghost River, but as it turns out, that is not where it gets its name from. So here it is. By sleeping during the day, and with Gerinifins concealed in whatever camouflage was on hand, and flying during the night, the group of escapees gradually made their way east and north away from the Blood River. Heading into the heart of the salt flats made pursuit less likely, but at the same time, it also made it harder to find water and food. The bone-chilling cold didn't help. The riders shivered practically every moment they were awake, buffeted by the constant wintry wind, which sounds truly miserable. And if you have ever been cold for a prolonged period where you are shivering like that, your muscles begin to actually ache because they're constantly spasming from the cold. It's the weirdest thing. I haven't had this a lot, but there have been a few times where I have wound up in the position of having to be outside for a long time or in a room inside that is very cold. And afterwards, my body felt exhausted and tired because it was just shivering constantly all day, which was activating all these muscles in this really weird way. And they're running out of food and water, and because the landscape is kind of almost like a desert, it's giving this impression of not making any progress, and they're all starting to get a little bit concerned about where they're heading and if they're going to find food or not. And then, on the evening of the fifth day, something new appeared. Tiny dots, medium squares, triangles that resembled shark's teeth, big circles with spiraling arms that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. And it turns out that these are all huge shapes made out of piles of rocks that have been assembled in this way, which there are actual, like, I don't know what to call these, like almost mosaics that are made out of stones that you can only see from above, which has caused a lot of speculation, especially among the ancient aliens types, which I never really understood until the past few years how insulting the concept of, like, well, ancient peoples were too primitive and stupid to come up with this, so it must be aliens is. But yeah, not a great look. So it's fascinating to see this here, especially because, like, there's Garinophins, which would explain how people would see these artworks as they're working on them. But I'm assuming that we didn't have dragons, and I don't know what the way, did they just figure it out from the ground? I mean, that is not an impossible thing, but it would definitely be difficult. The amount of labor and organization that would be required to construct them was unimaginable. This could not have been the work of a single tribe. Even if the Peku of the Liuku had conceived of such a vision, it would have taken generations of back-breaking labor to construct it. The riders fell silent with awe, and even the Garinophins seemed stunned. They hesitated and circled in the air at the edge of the gigantic designs, refusing to cross into the air above them. And I think that's a really neat thing, that the Garinophins are just like, look, we don't know what these are, but we don't really just want to fly over them because that just feels mad disrespectful. Honestly, I think that's kind of a good instinct. Like, I don't think they're going to shoot lasers at you or anything, but, you know, maybe just approach things with a little bit of caution, because who fucking knows? So they land, and they're trying to decide what to do. They decide to let the Garinophins go. There's water here, and it's going to last longer if they don't have to water the Garinophins. So those head south. Whether they would be able to make their way out of the salt flats before they fell from the sky mad with thirst was something the refugees would never know. I really hope so. I don't want these Garinophins to just fucking die of thirst. Like, that would suck. So eventually they come across these mounds. And it says, even in the middle of winter, it was obvious there was something odd about this region. Though much of the salt flats was inhospitable to any form of life, between the mounds could be seen the husks of leafless shrubs, as well as a carpet of dry, dead grass and leaves. "Hey, we could take shelter in those hills," said Razutana, "and there's the lake." After many days through the salt flats, they had finally reached the shore of the inland sea, which lay just west of the mounds. Just the thought of building a shelter against the relentless cold wind and nestling in a blank of soft, dry hay was enough to get the children to quicken their steps. But Satari stopped, gazed at the mounds, and knelt down. So Satari kneels and begins to chant. And it's really a mark of how seriously everybody takes her and takes, like, the lore of this place, and generally believes that, like, there is some shit that you just respect, that even the children start to get kind of freaked out by her behavior and begin kneeling as well. She has these bone tiles that she reads, and she cuts her hand in response. It's like whatever she reads there is telling her what to do. And she begins to circle around them and chant and press her hand to their faces and leave a smear of blood. And she does this 3 times so that they have blood across forehead, nose, and chin. After Satari had completed her 3 rounds, she knelt down again and prayed some more. Where are we? The city of ghosts. The Every Mother demands that we survive winter in this forbidden place. It's up to us to see how many of us will make it. And I am really interested in what exactly this means, because I assumed when we saw that there was, like, mounds, that this was a sort of burial place. It may not be that simple. the description of the like dry grass and shrubs between these hills feels like really specific, and I'm also really curious about that. Like what was planted here or what used to live here that is now dead. Like there's just, and the fact that she is saying that every mother says that we need to like stay here and stay alive. Is this some sort of test? Has this been done before? And like how it doesn't look like there's anything alive. It's just this lake. So how? Just a lot of questions. So, all right. We go to chapter 44, the third contest, and we start inside a dream of Mota's. It turns out that Mota is a veteran of the fight that sort of changed everything. And he had been attacked by a Gerinifin and almost killed. And this is a recurring dream. After fighting in Zathan Gulf, he is one of the only survivors, and he really struggles with the fact that people seem to be kind of respectful of it and in awe of him, even though he feels the fact that he survived and others didn't is not only super unfair in general, but feels like a rejection by the gods, like he was not worthy to die, like he had the chance to die, and they basically like sent him back to his body in disgrace. So he has got a lot of survivor's guilt and a lot of resentment for people who behave as if he is a hero, because as far as he is concerned, there is nothing heroic about anything that he did, and he was in charge of people who didn't survive, which means that the fact that he didn't have the decency to die along with them is kind of shameful. So he is avoiding going back to places with people that he knew after this fight because he doesn't want to face them wondering why he's alive and the people that he was in charge of are not. Which I want to say, of course, nobody would feel that way, but people can be deeply unreasonable, and they might. He may not be totally wrong about this. So then we get this really interesting POV from him about the way that he sees what's going on with the Empress, or the Regent, I guess. Let's see, here it is. Having given all she had to defend the people of Dara, the marshal had then passed beyond the river on which nothing floats. But the Liuku were still there on Rui and Dasu, still waiting to invade. Their Gerinifins grew stronger by the day, craving for a chance to do to all what they had done to him and his dead comrades. And I love throughout this we have Arona chiming in and reminding him of the present moment. Dandelions are blooming everywhere. Can you see the drifting seeds? They always remind me of jellyfish swimming through the air. Still curled on his side and shivering, he opened his eyes and looked beyond the window. It was true. White tufts gently floated through the breeze as carefree as children at play. Her voice calmed him. She knew that talking about the present, about the everyday beauty of the world, about the reality of living, breathing, moving, eating, was what he needed in moments like this. He didn't answer, but simply wrapped an arm around her, resting one of his strong, broad hands against her back. I just love this moment so much. There is just something about how indirectly she is comforting him and giving him what he needs to get through this flashback, essentially, that is really touching. And then it seemed as if everyone was in a hurry to forget about the war, to forget about Rui and Dasu, to forget about how Emperor Ragan, Marshal Mazzotti, and Empress Una had died. Because again, he believes the whole thing about how Thera died, and I keep forgetting that she had like a different name. The humiliating peace treaty, which required Dara to pay the Liuku tribute every season, was celebrated as a trade pact that preserved the peace. There were no commemorative monuments erected to the memory of the Battle of Zathan Gulf. Efforts to recover the bodies and bones of the dead from that terrible day were called off. There was no recruitment drive to build up the army, the navy, or the air force. There was no talk from Empress Gia, the regent, of seizing the first opportunity to free the people in the conquered islands. The men and women who had fought and died to drive back the Liuku had been erased. Their names were recorded on tablets in the hall of Mota, but there were no plays by the imperial troops celebrating their lives, no poems commissioned by the throne to memorialize their bravery, no proclamations by Empress Gia on the day of the grave mending festival urging everyone to remember what they had done. Even the name of Marshal Mazzotti was seldom brought up by the regent, as though the marshal were not a hero at all, but an embarrassment, a death as inconsequential as a feather in the wind. And this really is like because, we have seen the point of view from Thera about his frustrations with Gia and the way she simply doesn't want to acknowledge the martial powers that remain, the fact that she doesn't want to go to war. There is a lot of parallel in how he feels to how Mato feels, but Mota, but his point of view is much less about the pride of the situation. Like Thera, it all feels as if, how can you not care about your country and have pride enough in your country to want to go after these people who have done such horrible things? Don't you give a shit? Don't you want to invest in the fight? And there's a real childishness in a way to how he is approaching all of this. Whereas Mota, and the way that he is, like, he has experience in the fight itself, and he had an expectation of how things were going to go. And the way that Gia is behaving is, in his eyes, profoundly disrespectful and a failure to uphold what he thought was like a tacit agreement between those who fought and the crown, essentially, as to the value of their lives, really, is what it comes down to. And he's feeling really betrayed. And I'm going to read this as well. There were no special pensions or honors given to Marines, soldiers, and aviators or sailors who had fought in the Battle of Zathan Gulf. Being a soldier, a warrior who fought for the survival of Dara, was treated as a career unworthy of recognition. Veterans who wanted to return to civilian life retired with nothing more than their wages and the promise of a plot of land in remote corners of Dara. Many veterans sold their land and turned the money into drink or gambled it away, too disappointed with the coldness with which the Empress regarded their service. He could live with the guilt of having survived, with the shame of not being able to live up to the ideals of his own heroes, but what he could not bear was the thought that his comrades had died in vain, that the name of Captain Atamu would be forgotten, that Marshal Mazzotti would be thought of as a traitor who had barely redeemed herself. He could not tolerate the idea that the Liuku were allowed to put their roots down in Rui and Dasu, to enslave and slaughter while growing fat from tribute from the rest of Dara. Empress Gia was a tyrant, Mota realized. Her distrust of men and women who took up arms to defend the homeland was based on her love of power. I mean, look, the thing is, as much as I want to be like, that's not it, it's not it. Like, she recognizes that underfunding all of these different arms of the military is a way to keep anybody from turning things like that against her. And as much as he is misinterpreting some of this, overall, what it comes down to is that she really doesn't appreciate like what this feels like to people who really risked it all. Because Gia honestly is pretty self-centered about what it is that people are sacrificing versus what she is sacrificing. And she doesn't seem to be able to like put herself in the shoes of others and consider how it would feel to, you know what I mean, to be subjected to this treatment. What she thinks is, I'm just going to pull back on the martial aspects of Dara, and everybody who has already like sacrificed a lot is just feeling like, oh, really? You're going to pull back now when we are looking to be repaid for what we've done and when the job isn't even fully completed? And I can't be mad at him for that. And then we have him thinking, he was sorry he could not devote himself wholly to Rona, the way to the life that she wanted. O gods of Dara, aid me in my task. He might not be a hero, but he was going to make sure that true heroes would not be forgotten. And then perhaps he would finally be at peace, would finally be able to be the man Arona deserved. And I have to assume this is related to the like cave robbery that they're proposing later, but I genuinely don't know how that will work. So then we go to the actual event. Since great restaurants in Dara were chosen for official banquets, etc., they were expected to not only provide great service and cook delicious food, but also supply suitable entertainment. In addition, because prominent restaurants were city institutions, the public expected them to sponsor shows at big holidays like New Year and the Lantern Festival. Tifon Hutto's proposed contest was focused on this last aspect of restaurateurship. The treasure chest and the splendid urn were each going to put on a production for the judges, one that would live up to the title of Best Restaurant in Ginpen. And again, like, I get the connection he's trying to make here between what they do and a regular restaurant, but it feels really tenuous to me. It's just, I just don't buy it. So here we go. Dandelion is talking about how it'll be hard to know how to beat Hutto without knowing exactly what his plan is. And Mota is like, dude, look, and he doesn't talk that much, so this really gets everybody's attention. Everybody winds up doing the same thing, even when it has shown to not work. And he mentions that the Liuku were so proud of their Garinifins that even when they were alerted to the fact that some specifically anti-Garinifin weapons were being formulated, they still didn't really adapt. And Kinri has to restrain himself because it's feeling very insulting. So basically what he's saying is, what has Tifon Hutto always prioritized? And just basically like expand from there and you will know what he's going to do. And at first, everybody is talking about how he's a cheater. And Dandelion's like, oh, wait, that's not what you meant. We are going by what he looks like to us. But what we need to do is approach it thinking about how he sees himself and what he thinks is like a winning strategy and impressive to other people. And what he thinks is impressive is money and luxury and being able to give people things that are really unusual or out of reach unless you have a lot of money. And it's an interesting moment where Dandelion says that it's like a story about yourself that you can't escape, which really just, that's a way of saying we all fall into the same patterns over and over again, which I think is brutal, but true. So then we have this beautiful scene where Kinri comes up behind Dandelion and she's painting, and she paints in a really physical way, flinging her brush. And she doesn't know he's there, and he's watching her. And because she's like making these big movements, she smacks him right in the face with her brush. And she's laughing, and he says, "I think that painting is beautiful." And we have this thing, you guys, if I am, this is one of those moments where I'm like, can Liu talk to women? He talked to some women and he got some fucking real insight, or else he's just like, I experienced this. But I have to admit, I don't believe that men would experience this as often as women do. Dandelion was used to boys praising her painting. She knew that most of the time they weren't really commenting on the painting at all, much like the boys who held tea tasting parties in indigo houses would write poetry about the fragrance of the beverage while keeping their eyes on the girls doing the brewing. She resented this sort of false praise and was disappointed to hear it from Kinri. It took me so long to understand. I would get compliments from men or boys, and there was always something that irked me, and I never really, I always felt kind of bad that I would be irked when they were giving me a compliment. And this was why, because a part of me understood they weren't complimenting my work. They were complimenting my appearance, which I have very little control over, which isn't really a compliment. It's just lust. And they were completely ignoring the thing I had put my time and effort into for the sake of what I looked like and how much I appealed to them personally, which is just a really disappointing place to be. So she reacts to Kinri's comment as if he's one of those boys and asks, "Where is the kiln in my painting?" And Kinri basically goes on to describe in total detail every aspect of her painting, what each thing represents, and the energy of it that she has captured here. And he turns and sees her expression and immediately starts apologizing. He's like, "I don't know what I'm talking about." And she says, "No, you didn't say anything wrong. No one has ever understood my painting. Not even my brother." And he has to go on and compare it to snail slime. And I get what he's doing, but after having compared her to fiery, sparkling cobwebs, which she did not take well, I was a little worried about how this would be received. She's cool with it. But yeah, this moment of him really seeing what she's doing, this is just really beautiful. And it's the sort of thing that I think you come across very rarely, and it's very meaningful. I just really, really liked this. And he mentions, it reminds me of the voice paintings back home. And he describes what they were. And there was a part of me that felt like when he said the voice paintings back home, it felt like maybe he slipped up a little bit. I don't know. And she says, "I wish I could see such a voice painting being made one day. Even if the shaman is Liuku and I am Dara, I'm sure we can talk about our art." And I was like, yeah, I feel like Dandelion is starting to pick up on something here, Kinri. So then she asks about servants going to the storytelling dances. He kind of fucks up and says they don't, and then remembers that he's supposed to have been a servant and is like, well, not usually. And this is when he tells her the story of Afer and Kikisavo. And it winds up laying the groundwork for what they go with later on for their part of the competition. So we have this talk about Lady Mira and the hegemon and the way that they saw each other and understood one another in a way that others didn't. And just how important it was to her. And there's a moment where she is talking about how her sister Thera was not impressed with Mira. And I'm trying to find the spot because she says something as if dying for romantic love is somehow less. Yeah, here it is. My sister didn't think much of Mira. She devoted her life to someone else, and her greatest accomplishment was to have loved a man. As if somehow dying for romance was worse than dying for a king. As if prizing love was less than prizing some other ideal. And I kind of appreciated that. Because it can be very frustrating as a woman to have our stories revolve around men a lot of the time. So in a way, I really do understand Thera's frustration. But I like Dandelion seeing past the basics of she loved a man and seeing it as he also saw her for who she was and prized her because of her connection to him. And it's just such an odd story, remembering how it was with Mira and the Hegemon, you know, and how like poorly that began. And then the way that she genuinely began to like see him, it was such an odd development. But Konfiji said that men should be willing to die for great lords who recognize their talent, but I think the word usually rendered as talent has been mistranslated. A better word would be nature or capacity, tendency, quality of spirit. The Hegemon recognized Mira's nature. He was the mirror of her soul. That was why she died, no less heroically than Rathomiro or Munkakri. They looked into each other's eyes. Can we see each other the way we want to be seen? Can we recognize our souls in each other's vision? Should I... And then they get distracted and the conversation has to end. But I love this. It reminds me a little bit of a moment in I think it's 1994 or 96, Little Women. And Joe is watching an opera with Professor Bear. And they're like up in the rafters, basically, looking down. And he's translating what the song is, the lyrics. And the lyrics are, I listened with ravished soul in the depths of the fragrant night to your beloved voice. Your heart understood mine. And I just love that. I love that so much. And it just sort of reminds me of that, like the idea of just like what happens when your soul understands somebody else's. And it is a fucking rare thing, and it can be really scary. And it's the sort of thing that you may think you have, but I think sometimes it can change over time, because I would have said that I had this with Brendan, and now looking back, I realize I didn't really. I will say now, I do think that I have this with Owen, and enough time has passed, I'm pretty confident on that. But, you know, we change as well, and other people change, so that is also something that might be in flux a lot more than we wish. So, I'm going to sort of like speed through the parade and stuff, because I don't have that much time left, and honestly it doesn't feel like hugely important, the actual details of the parade and the way that it's carried off. What is important here is what Tifan Hutto has decided he's going to do. So the whole thing here is that he is recreating the victory parade that, and I'm trying to find the spot where because I feel like Widowasu specifically mentions this here. The last time was when Mapidare passed through here, and she's like, here it is. He's literally recreating Emperor Mapidare's victory parade through Ginpen. How could he possibly think this is a good idea? And it turns out that as much as Widowasu is assuming everybody's going to be hugely offended by this, and there definitely are those who feel that way, there are other people who are younger who are very into it and think it's kind of fun. And Dandelion says, I'm thinking maybe he's decided to like do something kind of smart. He's turning Zana into Dara. So Weedy says, Emperor Mapidare has always been a figure of controversy. The House of Dandelion began as rebels against Zana tyranny, but when the rebellion succeeded, instead of restoring the world to separate Tiro states, Emperor Ragan recreated the Zana Empire under a different name. And, of course, Dandelion gets very defensive here, but Weedy is like, I'm not saying he was wrong, I'm just pointing out the House of Dandelion couldn't condemn the whole of the legacy of Mapidare and left an opening for Tifan. There's always a tendency for those who didn't personally experience suffering to romanticize aspects of the past that seem better than the present. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose it just feels like, you know, what it's making me sort of think of is making a restaurant that's like a 50s or 40s soda jerk kind of thing. And it's like, oh, it's retro and it's so cool. And when you think about like what the world is actually like, especially for minorities in that era, it's like a lot less cute. But let's ignore all that and just look at the aesthetic. And that is sort of what it seems like he's doing here. And this is when Weedy says the Empress Regent seems to disdain all military institutions and martial strength. After comparing the strength displayed by Mapidare then and the weakness showed by the Empress now, it's easy for people to become nostalgic for him and everything associated with him, more so if you have no memory of his reign or only vague recollections from childhood. And that's very unfortunate, especially having read Mapidare's reign and how brutal and bloody it was. Yikes. And this is when Kinri is like caught off guard by a bunch of men who are dressed to be like Liuku prisoners. And he's looking at the weapons and he's like, those are real. All of those weapons. Why would he bother making things that look so real? And Weedy is like, there's something about this that's not sitting right. Something's going on. And then we have these airships that show up. In reality, these airships were used for transporting quick spoiling freight for the Tifan clan's commercial empire and had only been painted to resemble military ships. Still, they evoked legends and memories of a time when Dara had flown massive airships, powered by pure lift gas that came out of pristine Lake Dako. Instead of today, when airships were modest vessels suitable only for transporting time-critical cargo. And all of this is like reminding me of air shows that we see, like these planes doing these tricks that were actually used like in warfare and were incredibly dangerous. And now it's like a form of entertainment, you know? And we find out about the way that Gia has managed to sort of like cut off access to the lift gas and she has starved a lot of these areas of funding to make new warships and everything. So yeah, this is quite a spectacle. And Ratiera is like, oh boy, what we were going to do, we find out later, isn't going to work. They were going to recreate the attempted assassination of Mapidare with the kite that they flew at the very beginning of the first book. So what they wind up doing is they take the story that Kinri told Dandelion and they tell that story with the aid of the speaking trumpet. So it's over like an intercom essentially. And they use Dandelion's paintings to make these like really immersive experiences, like they're going through the ocean and all of this stuff. And it sounds really, really dope, to be honest. And I thought that like, this is what I'm talking about with like, it was very absorbing and it sounded cool as hell. But it just, once I stopped afterward and thought about it, I was like, this is just not really what I'm thinking it would be. For 10 days and nights, Kikisavo and Afir fought the great whale, neither yielding an inch. The waves from their struggle wrecked the coast, and innumerable denizens of the sea were tossed ashore, providing a bounty for the tribes living by the shore. And we get this all from Pimie's POV, which is the young kid who is a judge, and he is entranced and wants to go back in right away, and they are like, sorry, bro, but we've got to let other people have a chance. And Dandelion and Kinri had to like work round the clock to make this happen. Of course, they wind up winning. And Tifon Houto doesn't even show up for the ceremony because it's too humiliating. And it says, to be sure, not everyone in Ginpen was enamored of the splendid Urn's entry into the final contest. Quite a few discharged veterans grumbled that the ride seemed to resemble Liuku propaganda. How could glorifying the myths of the enemy even be contemplated when Dasu and Rui remained unredeemed? More than a few scholars threatened to organize a boycott of the splendid urn to express their displeasure. And Widowasu donates a month's profits from the urn to healing monks at the Temple of Rufizo. And I was like, that was a pretty smart move, actually. But yeah, this whole thing, like the way that people are reacting, it's understandable, you know? I mean, this isn't just like there's a temptation for me to compare the reaction that they're having to the way that some folks have reacted to like Islam being included in a curriculum about world religions in schools. But even that, like most people who would be speaking out against including Islam would not have been personally victimized by anybody from that culture. Whereas in this universe, pretty much everybody has been personally touched by the like way that the Yuku has attacked and are an occupying force. So it's just not a fair comparison. But nevertheless, like, I do think that anytime you just decide to completely throw away a culture, it's not a good idea. Like, learning about them is always going to be smart. And that's kind of the way that Dandelion manages to convince Mota later, because he is very resistant, understandably, after being in his head. And at the end of this chapter, we find out about the whole thing with this weird cave. And the fact that this cave had been like a place where kids hung out, you know, teens would go to make out, things like this. And it has been taken over by the government and cut off from everything and guarded really carefully. And Dandelion is like, why would we go there? And Arona says, we're not going to steal anything, but I hear there's a library there too. We're just going to look, said Ratiera. Can you imagine the secrets that must be hidden there? It's said that some of the rarest books in all Dara are stored there, said Weedy. And there may be documents there about the marsh. Mota stopped when Arona put a calming hand on his shoulder. He took a deep breath, seemingly keeping his emotions in check with great effort, about what happened during the war. Dandelion looked at him oddly, but said nothing. All this is beside the point. How can we possibly get in there? Arona looked at Kinri and smiled. We've been planning this for a long time. And they get interrupted by somebody coming and saying that Rati and Weedy have an urgent message. And I am really worried about that because I just feel like I don't trust anything lately. And the very last chapter is extremely short. Chapter 45. Thera had never felt so alone. And it's basically 3 pages of her blaming herself for everything that happened, feeling certain that everyone else blames her, and they won't say so, but they are disappointed in her and ashamed of her, that she is a failure and helpless, that she thought she was a leader and she was fooling herself. And honestly, it would be tempting to just call this like a self-pity party, but she has lost everything. So she thinks, you know, like, I just can't imagine. I really can't. And I'm hoping that she manages to find out that her children are still alive sooner than later. I don't know how that would even happen. But if she does, maybe she can internalize the need to be a little bit more ruthless because they are alive due to the fact that other people saw that she wasn't going to be willing to do what it took. So, I just feel so bad for her. And she's just constantly crying and trying to keep her face hidden so that other people don't see. And all I could think was like, they know, girl, they know already. And they're not looking and they're not saying because they don't want to hurt you, but they know. It was just really hard to read. I just felt so like, because yeah, she has every right, you know? I am helpless to help. How much longer until sunset? How much longer until sunrise? How many more days must I go on like this? And that got to me, guys. Just the counting of the hours, just trying to get through. That's very real, especially when you're grieving and feeling like you're not going to make it. And you just have to get through the next half hour. You know, that's what it takes sometimes. I just thought this was really well written and just devastating. So, yeah, that is the end of this section. I'm just really not sure about the intent they have to go. They're saying we're not stealing anything from Last Bite. I'm not sure I believe that. It just feels like something weird is going on, and I'm wondering if the point is because they are players that they were going to tell a story that was like supposed to be hidden and try and make that public and sort of potentially take their lives in their hands if they go against the propaganda that is popular. Because obviously the way that Mota is talking about Gin Mazzotti and maybe there being information about her, I don't know what it is he's hoping to find. So, because we know that everything that happened with Gin Mazzotti was a setup and that Gio was like, you know, fucked her royally. But I don't know what he suspects. And even though we know that, I have a hard time believing that is like just written down anywhere to go and find. So what is it that he's thinking he's going to see? Is there a record of the fact that this was a setup? Or, you know, like, is there a place that would be kept and the assumption would be that security is so good we don't have to worry about anybody finding it? I genuinely don't feel like that's getting written down. I don't know. I just genuinely feel like I am going into this next section with no idea what we're after anymore. But I am hoping that Kinri and Dandelion are able to connect. Fingers crossed for them. They're good kids. All right. I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Appreciate you. Until next time. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.